Well, good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives 3. Also broadcasting with Neighborhood News Studio at 11 a.m. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Fridays of this week and every week. And we're glad to be with Neighborhood News Studio once again this morning. This is a recorded reading that I'm going to do, so I say hello to the chat. I'm sorry I can't interact with you guys this morning, but I had to rearrange a medical appointment. So, in order to do that, I'm pre recording this morning's show. We are at part 5 now of my readings and comments from The True Flag by Stephen Kinzer, one of my favorite authors, and a person who, while maybe a deep state oriented writer, does take the trouble to tell us a lot of interesting details and tie things together in a way that only somebody with his perspective can do. I'm not saying he's always right, of course, but in terms of giving us a narrative that exposes the difference between the true flag, the flag of our founding fathers, the flag that we consider to be the flag of liberty, and the flag that was taken by the imperialists and turned into what they use as their flag, and assuming that they have our permission to act on our behalves just because they are the elites. And that is what I call the false flag. So this book does help us distinguish between the parties who is for the real flag and who is an imperialist. And we have to do this because that's behind all of the theory of imperialism is behind the misuse of our banking system that is being misused in order to concentrate wealth at the top, which is the essence of what empires do. So, are we an empire or a republic? Well, I'm afraid we're an empire at this point, but we still have the documents, we still have the framework, and we can be a republic again if the American people will that it be. Make it so, as Captain Picard would say. Let's make it so. Let's be a republic again. Let's respect the rights of other countries. Let's be a sovereign nation among sovereign nations. Let's be prepared to defend ourselves, but not to take over other countries. Well, that's the fight. And the fight started a long time ago in 1898, specifically over the Spanish American War. Okay. And I had just spoken about the Rough Riders, how they were a combination of Texas tough guys, people of various professions, quacks, prospectors, socialists, journalists, and they also were uh, a pack of what he calls Eastern swells from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and many other colleges, and from clubs like the Somerset Club of Boston and the Knickerbocker Club of New York. Well, those are the elite families. So this is a claim by the elites uh, on the imperialist side saying, yes, we will go and fight against Spain, and we will take the possessions of Spain and make them the possessions of the United States empire. Well, that's what's happening in this book on page 43. Let me continue reading on the next page. Resplendent in a white dress uniform, Admiral Dewey welcomed a uniquely important guest upon the Olympia on the morning of May 18th, 1898. This was one of the most fateful meetings in the history of American foreign policy. No one knows what transpired. Dewey's guest was the Filipino rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo, whose revolutionaries had been fighting Spanish rule for 4 years. Aguinaldo had been in exile in Hong Kong, and Dewey dispatched an American warship, the USS McCulloch, to bring him home. The Filipino force under his command numbered several thousand. Dewey realized that it could be expanded almost without limit if the United States would provide enough weaponry. He had crushed Spanish sea power. He wanted Aguinaldo to do the same on land. Their partnership bore quick results. Dewey sent Aguinaldo ashore with 100 rifles and directed the United States consul in Hong Kong to buy him 2,000 more. Nonetheless, this must have been an odd meeting. Neither man spoke the other's language well, and no interpreter was present. That may have served American purposes. Aguinaldo came away believing he had a deal. Filipino rebels would fight and defeat the Spanish, after which the United States would recognize the Philippines as an independent country. Dewey later insisted that he had promised no such thing. Doesn't that remind you of what's going on in the Ukraine now, and with Russia, and the promise of I think it was Baker was with the CIA contingent saying to Russia, if you let us reunify Germany, we will not take another step to the east. And that, of course, is the same type of a lie that Dewey must have propounded upon Mr. Aguinaldo 100 years earlier. It is the word of a Malay adventurer, a Malay patriot, if you please, against the word of an American admiral and gentleman, reasoned the Hartford Courant. We believe George Dewey. During the last days of May and the first days of June, the United States began deploying soldiers to fight on two fronts nearly 10,000 miles apart. The vanguard of the Philippine Expeditionary Force landed at Cavite near Manila on May 25th. 2 days later, the United States Navy began a blockade of Santiago in eastern Cuba. On June 10th, U.S. Marines landed at Guantanamo Bay. Roosevelt's Rough Riders made their way by train from San Antonio to Tampa, Florida, and sailed for Cuba on June 13th. At this moment, the Spanish-American War, as it later came to be known, took its strangest territorial twist. This was originally about Cuba. Puerto Rico would become a target because it was near Cuba. The Philippines were vulnerable after Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet there. Then, most unexpectedly, a fourth land emerged as a candidate for annexation: Hawaii. 5 years earlier, in 1893, the United States had supported an uprising in which white planters and their allies deposed the Hawaiian monarchy. They tried to bring Hawaii into the United States, but before Congress could accept, the anti-imperialist Grover Cleveland returned to the presidency and blocked their ambition. Now, with Cleveland out of the White House and war threatening in the Philippines, senators who favored annexing Hawaii saw a second chance. So this is something we should make note of, that Grover Cleveland was an anti-imperialist. Something maybe we don't know about from just history. All we read about is his two inconsecutive terms and his young matron of the White House. But personal stuff is thrown at us in history books, but they don't tell us this, that he was an anti-imperialist. He fought against Henry Cabot Lodge. Okay, annexation of Hawaii would serve various interests. President Sanford Dole of Hawaii, D-O-L-E, Dole, yes, Pineapple Dole, wanted to open the American market to Hawaiian sugar and fruit. Lodge, Roosevelt, and Captain Mahan, that's later Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, we've talked about him earlier, saw Hawaii as an ideal base from which to project military power across the Pacific. Merchants and manufacturers salivated at the prospect of a launching pad for trade with China. Magazines and newspapers were full of calculations about the fabulous wealth that awaited them if they could persuade the Chinese to wear cotton clothes, use American kerosene, build with American nails, or began eating bread and meat instead of rice and vegetables. For 5 years, these arguments had failed to persuade Congress that the United States needed Hawaii. That changed in the tumult of 1898. At the beginning of May, Lodge introduced a measure to annex Hawaii. He cleverly shaped it to improve its chances for passage. Rather than frame it as a treaty, which would require a two-thirds majority in the Senate, he submitted it as an amendment to the War Revenue Bill. That would allow it to be adopted by a simple majority in the House and Senate. McKinley liked the idea. Carl Schurz, who had campaigned for McKinley, was shocked to see him supporting the seizure of a distant archipelago. On May 9th, he wrote again to McKinley. He insisted that despite Dewey's brilliant victory at Manila, Americans must remain to our true promise that this is to be a war of deliverance. Quote, but as the newspapers foreshadow, the administration takes advantage of the war to press the annexation of Hawaii now. That annexation having been violently discountenanced by the public opinion of the country before the war began, it is certain that the confidence of the world in the unselfishness of our policy will be destroyed. From that time on, it would be useless to protest that this is not a war of selfish ambition and conquest. Schurz wrote to McKinley every couple of weeks, but Lodge was in the White House almost every day. With gentle persistence, he pressed a simple case. Now that the United States had become involved in the Philippines, taking Hawaii, which lays halfway across the Pacific, was a, quote, military necessity, unquote. Slowly, McKinley came to agree. He called for another 75,000 volunteers and began sounding like a convert. We need Hawaii just as much and a good deal more than we did California, he told a visitor to the White House. It is manifest destiny. Well, a few more, I suppose, examples of the dispute. Here is Senator John Tyler Morgan of Alabama saying it was foolish to dwell on the Constitution when vital interests are at stake. Taking Hawaii, he said, was absolutely necessary for properly providing for the situation. As precedent, he cited Jackson's invasion of Florida in 1818, which brought the United States rich new territory that it probably could not have obtained legally. There are men still alive in this world who would have the old Jackson stock in them, and plenty of it, Morgan said. Senators agreed not to vote on annexation until they could debate it publicly. This closed session, though, showed that many of them were excited at the prospect of overseas expansion. So were most Americans. Quote, a sort of bellicose fever had seized the American nation, the French ambassador wrote. For the London Times, it was, quote, the delirium of war. An Italian correspondent called it manic possession for what has never been done before, manic passion for what has never been done before. To the Kölnische Zeitung, that's the Cologne, Germany newspaper, it was, quote, lust for conquest. Le Temps in Paris says the United States had become the predestined instrument of that imperialism that is latent in every democracy. Whoa, that was nice. America's rush to world power began with astonishing suddenness in the spring of 1898. Over the course of just a few months, the United States and its people changed profoundly. Opponents of expansion scrambled to organize and marshal their arguments. Isn't that kind of what we're going through now with opponents to the World Economic Forum, opponents to the World Health Organization, opponents to the UN, opponents to Agenda 2030, opponents to all of this. We're scrambling to marshal our resources. We are way, way behind the eight ball. And that's what happened in 1898. Opposition was disjointed and not financed. And so it didn't work. No matter what you say, if you don't have organization and finance, you're not going to persuade anybody. Well, on the other side, William Dean Howells, a social reformer and novelist, says, quote, "We desire to call attention to the manifest folly of contributing even in the slightest degree to the warlike feelings so prevalent in the country. The cruelty exhibited in Cuba is no peculiarity of the Spanish race. Within the last few weeks, instances of cruelty to Negroes have occurred in this country which equal, if they do not surpass, anything which has occurred in Cuba. Our crusade in this matter should begin at home. Our crusade in this matter should begin at home. We see every day the vast injustices prevailing in our own land, the hopeless toil, the wretched poverty, the armies of unemployed, and until we remove these beams from our own eyes, we should not presume to take the mote from our brothers." Unquote. Charles Eliot Norton, who had begun his career in the East India Company and then in the East India trade, and then forsaken it to become a scholar and social reformer. Quote, "A generation has grown up that has known nothing of war. The blessings of peace have been poured out upon us. And now, of a sudden, without cool deliberation, without prudent preparation, the nation is hurried into war, and America, she who more than any other land was pledged to peace and goodwill on earth, unsheathes her sword. My friends, America has been compelled against the will of all her wisest and best to enter into a path of darkness and peril. Against their will, she has been forced to turn back from the way of civilization to the way of barbarities, to renounce for the time her own ideals. With grief, with anxiety, must the lover of his country regard the present aspect and the future prospect of the nation's life." Unquote. That day's audience included many of New England's most influential leaders. Norton's words were the call to arms for which they had been waiting. Immediately, a group of them, their hearts afire, resolved to present the case to a larger audience. They decided to hold a public rally at Faneuil Hall. The next available date was June 15th, a week away. From that rally, they charged forth into battle. Sleek warships announcing America's surging ambition reached two ports on June 20th, 1898. An enormous fleet, 48 vessels, approached Santiago, Cuba, as the sun set. Aboard one troop carrier was the newly commissioned Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. He was off on the adventure of a lifetime and aching with anticipation. Quote, "It is a great historical expedition, and I thrill to think I am part of it. If we are allowed to succeed, for certainly we will succeed if allowed, we have scored the first great triumph in what will be a world movement." This was the most popular war in American history. Thanks to the telegraph, it was also the first one in which Americans were able to follow it as it was being fought, reading about battles while they were still underway. The yellow press cracked with frenzied energy. Boatloads of correspondents flooded into Cuba. They needed heroes. The blunt-talking, buck-toothed, hyperactive Roosevelt fit the role perfectly. Even the iconoclastic Mark Twain briefly shared his country's excitement. Twain was living in Vienna, where he was a major celebrity and did not know that an anti-imperialist movement was growing at home. He spent his days writing and his evenings with a luminous circle of acquaintances, including Gustav Mahler, Johann Strauss, Arthur Schnitzler, Gustav Klimt, and Sigmund Freud, who skipped a medical lecture one evening and, by his own account, quote, treated myself to listening to our old friend Mark Twain in person, which was a sheer delight, unquote. In the spring of 1898, Twain's brother-in-law visited, and he reported that nearly all Americans considered the war in Cuba fully righteous. Do we not have that same situation right now where nearly all Americans feel that our war in Ukraine is fully righteous? And how did that happen? Well, William Randolph Hearst, you know, his legacy has been increased 1,000-fold. And now whatever we read, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said, we won't know what's going on. We'll just be reduced to repeating what we heard on the news last night. And that's the goal. Take it all away from the Americans, from the American people, and give it to the elites. And Teddy Roosevelt's there to do it. Twain agreed. For once he violated his own maxim, the majority is always in the wrong. What could be nobler, after all, than to liberate an oppressed nation and bless it with freedom? Quote, I have never enjoyed a war, even in written history, as I am enjoying this one. Twain wrote to his friend Joseph Twitchell in Hartford, quote, for this is the worthiest one that was ever fought. So far as my knowledge goes, it is a worthy thing to fight for one's freedom. It is another sight finer to fight for another man's. And I think this is the first time this has been done. Twain could not imagine how fully he would soon reverse this opinion. As he quietly applauded the war from far away, America's ambition grew. Roosevelt, his future antagonist, became the country's most outspoken expansionist. Coverage of the Rough Riders at their Texas camp had already made Roosevelt a national figure. He was about to leap further towards celebrity and myth. The reputation he won in Cuba during the summer of 1898 immeasurably strengthened his ability to rally Americans around his imperial vision. He raced into action while Twain dallied in Viennese drawing rooms. On the same day that Roosevelt and his Rough Riders caught sight of Cuba for the first time, a single American warship seized another territory 9,000 miles away. Secretary of the Navy John Long had ordered several warships based at Pearl Harbor to sail for the Philippines in case action was required there. He sent one commander, Captain Henry Glass of the USS Charleston, a set of secret orders to be opened only at sea. Once Hawaii had faded behind him, Glass assembled all hands on deck, dramatically broke the seal on his orders, and read them aloud. The Charleston was to proceed to the Philippines as planned, but not directly. On your way, you are hereby directed to stop at the Spanish island of Guam, Long wrote. You will use such force as may be necessary to capture the port of Guam, making prisoners of the governor and other officials and any armed force that may be there. You will also destroy any fortifications on said island and any Spanish naval vessels that may be there or in the immediate vicinity. These operations on the island of Guam should be very brief and should not occupy more than 1 or 2 days. Guam, a volcanic islet in the western Pacific, had been a Spanish colony since 1668 and was home to about 50,000 people. Its principal value to outsiders was and is its strategic location. It is a short sail to ports in China and Japan, and an ideal base from which to project commercial or military power in East Asia. Americans decided they should have it. The Charleston arrived on Guam on June the 20th, its crew eager to engage Spanish warships. To everyone's disappointment, the only vessel in the harbor was a Japanese brigantine picking up coconuts. With no ship to sink, Captain Glass ordered his men to bombard the crumbling Spanish citadel, Fort Santa Cruz. In a 4-minute volley, they fired 13 shells. There was no response. Soon afterward, a skiff flying the Spanish flag approached the Charleston. 2 Spanish officers came aboard and apologized for not having returned the American salute, quote unquote, because they had no gunpowder left in their arsenal. It turned out that they had not been resupplied for months and did not know the United States and Spain were at war. The next morning, an American lieutenant went ashore. He handed the Spanish commandant a message demanding surrender of the island within 30 minutes. 29 minutes later, the commandant emerged with a reply, quote, being without defenses of any kind and without any means for meeting the present situation, I am under the sad necessity of being unable to resist such superior forces and regretfully accede to your demands. Captain Glass sailed ashore. He ordered the American flag raised over Fort Santa Cruz. At the signal, the Charleston's shipboard band struck up the Star-Spangled Banner. Naval gunners fired a 21-gun salute. When they finished, Glass declared Guam to be American. That made him the first officer ever to seize an overseas territory for the United States. From Washington, Henry Cabot Lodge watched this operation with delight. The idea of taking small islands as coaling stations owed much to Captain Mahan, but it was Lodge who had brought it into mainstream Washington. Most Americans were too caught up with the Cuban drama to notice what had happened in Guam. Lodge understood that it masked the turn of epochs, as you wish. Quote, the flag which had risen first on the distant Atlantic coast floated out before the afternoon breeze of these remote islands which were henceforth to know new masters, he wrote in Harper's. The first possession in the Pacific which Magellan had given to the Spain that dominated and frightened Europe had passed away forever from the Spain which had ceased to rule and become a part of the Western Republic. Lodge was 48, 8.5 years older than Roosevelt, and although he was just as vigorous a warmonger, he was not the sort of man who to charge enemy lines himself. He recognized that he could do more for his cause by staying home. The corridors of Washington power suited him better than the battlefield. There he would fight for the duration of this conflict. The third member of the Jingo Triumvirate, William Randolph Hearst, felt no such restraint. After the declaration of war on Spain, he ran a triumphant front page headline that would have been outrageous if it was not at least partly true. How do you like the journal's war? Was the headline. Then, 35 years old and with no military experience, he applied for a commission as an officer in the U.S. Navy. Hearst's newspapers had relentlessly taunted President McKinley for his reluctance to join the imperial crusade. Just a few days before he applied for his commission, the Journal published an insolent letter from, quote, Uncle Sam, unquote, to McKinley. We have this war with Spain on our hands, it said. William, don't lack the moral courage. Go in for action. Demand action. Country above all, William, unquote. William being McKinley, of course. Not surprisingly, the Navy rejected Hearst. He appealed. At one point, he offered to pay for his own warship if he could command it. It was to no avail. He had been a principal promoter of this war, though, and was determined not to miss it. I would make a footnote here that Cornelius Vanderbilt earlier in the century had created had created a warship out of his biggest and most powerful steamer, and put a ram on the front of it and sailed that around the Caribbean during the earlier conflict over the Nicaragua/Panama Canal issue. Um, it's not the first time then that somebody wanted to arm their own warship and go to war for the interests of the United States, as they saw it, of course. Vanderbilt. However, it was to no avail. He had been a principal promoter of this war, though, and was determined not to miss it. As soon as Hearst realized that he would not be commissioned as a naval officer, he bought a steamship, the Sylvia, from the Baltimore Fruit Company and turned it into a floating news bureau, crammed with everything from photographic supplies to a printing press on which he hoped to produce the first newspaper in free, quote unquote, Cuba. His shipmates included a small army of correspondents, combat artists, personal attendants, and friends. They dropped anchor off eastern Cuba on June 18th and were soon joined by the pioneering motion picture cameraman Billy Blitzer. I wonder if there's any relation to Wolf Blitzer, who would later help make film history as cinematographer to D.W. Griffith. Well, that's an important connection to think about more. Um, D.W. Griffith, William Randolph Hearst, connected by motion picture cameraman Billy Blitzer. Hearst spent hours with Blitzer and a parade of other camp followers, hosting them on deck for champagne lunches in his blazer and Commodore's cap. Among Hearst's companions aboard the Sylvia were two teenage sisters, Millicent and Anita Wilson, who had been his ostentatiously public companions in New York for more than a year. They were chorus girls in the risque Broadway musicals he favored, and he loved showing up with them, one on each arm, at nightclubs and theater openings. Polite society was scandalized, but Hearst loved playing the showman. War did not change his style. A few days after arriving in Cuban waters, Hearst went ashore to meet the legendary General Calixto Garcia, commander of the Revolutionary Army in the eastern provinces. As a sign of gratitude for Hearst's role in promoting American intervention, Garcia presented him with a Cuban flag pockmarked by bullet holes. Hearst wrote a report of their encounter. He quoted Garcia as saying, quote, "The journal had been the most potent influence in bringing the United States to the help of Cuba, and that they would always remember the journal as a friend whose friends had been, when friends had been very few." Unquote. Roosevelt and his men landed near Santiago on the afternoon of June 22nd. They made camp and soon afterwards were told that their mission would be to help clear a path into the city. That required flushing Spanish troops out of the surrounding hills. The Rough Riders fought twice. Their first taste of combat came on June 24th when they marched into an ambush on their way inland near a village called Las Guasimas. Colonel Wood, accustomed to command, calmly gave orders as bullets flew. Quote, Roosevelt, on the contrary, jumped up and down literally, I mean with emotions evidently divided between joy and a tendency to run, unquote, a journal correspondent reported. Shooting continued for 90 minutes. 8 Rough Riders were killed, including Hamilton Fish, captain of the Columbia University crew team. In later years, Roosevelt would insist that he had not actually been ambushed, but had led his men in a planned maneuver aimed at drawing fire from the Spanish positions. Now, Hamilton Fish is a name that I need to explore. Is there one that was associated with the recent times, I have to look it up. Hamilton Fish. Soon after that skirmish, Colonel Wood was named to relieve a general who had collapsed from fever. That left Roosevelt, quote, to my intense delight, unquote, in command of the Rough Riders, with a field promotion to colonel. The attack on Santiago is to begin in a few hours, the correspondent wrote. In the bushes of the basin beneath us, 12,000 men are sleeping, buried in a sea of mist, waiting for the day, unquote. Over the course of that morning, several American units were ordered to move against Spanish defenders. Roosevelt waited with growing impatience as volleys of fire echoed around him. Finally, at about 1 o'clock, a rider turned up bearing the command for which he had been waiting, quote, move forward and support the regulars in the assault on the hills in front. Quote, the instant I received the order, I sprang on my horse, and then my crowded hour began. I waved my hat, and we went up the hill with a rush. What came to be known as the Battle of San Juan Hill was actually fought on a rise called Kettle Hill. It was part of a day-long wave of attacks that cost the lives of 205 Americans and 215 Spaniards. The result was a clear victory for the Americans, who by nightfall were in control of the ridgeline. Roosevelt called it the greatest day of my life. As fighting subsided, one of the most famous correspondents on the scene, the Journal's James Creelman, was seized by a wish to claim the flag of a defeated Spanish platoon. I wanted it for the Journal, he wrote later. The Journal had provoked the war, and it was only fair that the Journal should have the first flag captured in the greatest land battle of the war. Creelman dashed from cover and scooped up the flag he sought, but seconds after picking it up, he was hit in the shoulder by a Spanish bullet. He staggered toward a hillside and fell. A few minutes later, stunned and bleeding, he felt a hand on his forehead. Opening my eyes, I saw Mr. Hearst, the proprietor of the New York Journal, a straw hat with a bright ribbon on his head, a revolver in his belt, and a pencil and notebook in his hand, Creelman recalled in his memoir. Quote, the man who had provoked the war had come to see the result with his own eyes, and finding one of his correspondents prostrate, was doing the work himself. Slowly, he took down my story of the fight. Quote, I'm sorry you're hurt, but, and his face was radiant with enthusiasm, wasn't it a splendid fight? We must beat every paper in the world, unquote. While wounded reporter and excited editor were having this odd exchange, Roosevelt, a blue polka dot kerchief waving from his sombrero, was reveling in his victory at Kettle Hill. His 400 Rough Riders had dislodged a 100-man Spanish position. He found the fight exciting beyond measure. At its height, he gleefully shouted, quote, Holy Godfrey, what fun, unquote. To complete the archetypal rite, to prove his full manliness, especially to himself, Roosevelt needed to kill an enemy soldier. The only ones in sight were fleeing into the distance. Providentially, as Roosevelt and an aide-de-camp were surveying the aftermath of battle, two Spanish soldiers jumped from a trench about 10 yards away and began firing blindly at them. Roosevelt was carrying an exquisitely symbolic revolver, a Colt 38, that his brother-in-law, a Navy officer, had salvaged from the Maine. He drew it as the two Spaniards turned to run. I closed in and fired twice, missing the first and killing the second, he wrote afterward. He doubled up as neat as a jackrabbit. Later, Roosevelt took pains to emphasize that he had not shot the fleeing soldier in the back, but rather, quote, in the left breast as he turned, unquote. On that day, Roosevelt redeemed what he saw as his family's shame and tasted the battlefield glory of what he had dreamed since childhood. He also assumed the identity that would soon make him the most captivating public figure of his age. Gallant commander on horseback, saber in hand, charging into enemy gunfire in the cause of freedom. For years, Roosevelt had promoted the idea of American conquest. Now, he embodied it. Screaming headlines in the Journal and other newspapers portrayed the fighting in Cuba as an epic conflict. Hearst knew better, but in search of readers, he whipped his correspondence to ever bolder flights of fancy. As their copy flowed through his floating newsroom, he was seized by the desire to play at least a bit part in the war himself. Early on the morning of July the 4th, that part came his way. The Sylvia had sailed up to the abandoned and still smoldering wreck of a Spanish cruiser, and Hearst went aboard for a look. Then, scanning the beach with his binoculars, he spotted a tattered troop of Spanish sailors who had escaped the wreck. Clad in his white yachting suit and cap, he leapt into a launch, was rowed to shore, and waving a pistol, told the Spaniards they were his prisoners. 29 of them obediently came aboard the Sylvia. There, Hearst treated them to a full meal and led them in 2 rounds of cheers, one for the 4th of July and another for, quote, George Washington and Old Glory, unquote. After a few hours, he directed the Sylvia to approach the nearest American warship, the USS St. Louis, and announced to its captain that he had prisoners to deliver. With typical flair, he insisted on a receipt. An irritated officer complied, scrawling, quote, received of W.R. Hearst 29 Spanish prisoners, unquote. Hearst had a facsimile of the note published in the Journal. He framed the original. It hung on his office wall for years. Roosevelt understood the value of self-promotion at least as well as Hearst. He not only used the war to push himself into the public limelight as Hearst did, but he also found a way to project his image into elite circles. From the moment he left Washington to join his Rough Riders, he maintained almost daily correspondence with Henry Cabot Lodge, who vicariously shared the adventure. Lodge sent him breathless encouragement, often accompanied by newspaper clippings. Quote, you have won yourself a high place already as one of the popular heroes of the war. Lodge wrote after the Kettle Hill engagement, you can't win more distinction than you already have won so far as mere personal heroism is concerned. Roosevelt's letters overflowed with praise of his own bravery and battle skills. They were clearly written to be read aloud at salons and dinner parties back home. Lodge happily obliged. Quote, on the day of the big fight, I had asked my men to do a deed that European military writers consider utterly impossible of performance. That is, to attack over open ground, unshaken infantry, armed with the best modern repeating rifles behind a formidable system of entrenchments. Roosevelt wrote in one letter that Lodge shared with his friends, the only way to get them to do it in the way it had to be done was to lead them myself, unquote. No one could have managed Roosevelt's rise as deftly as Lodge. Groomed from childhood to command, he deeply understood the uses of power. He judged men shrewdly, cultivated them delicately, and manipulated them subtly. His web of social and political connections in Washington was dense. When fighting began in Cuba, he extended it by cultivating a group of admiring newspaper men. Through them, he played an unseen role in shaping American public opinion. Quote, each afternoon, a group of correspondents would congregate in his committee room and discuss with him the progress of the conduct of the struggle and the conduct of the struggle. Senator Lodge referred to his select group as his, quote, board of strategy, unquote. But in the press gallery, they were referred to by a phrase that was to become famous in another respect 34 years later, quote, the brain trust. Throughout the war, they met almost every day, and when the group later broke up, Senator Lodge presented each of the brain trusters with a gold stick pin bearing the golden eagle from the great American seal. With help from Lodge, as well as from Hearst's journal and the rest of the popular press, Roosevelt emerged from his 2 months in Cuba as a famous hero. This made him a hot political commodity. To make himself a more formidable candidate and to satisfy his private longings, Roosevelt decided that his, quote, crowded hour, unquote, in Cuba qualified him for the Congressional Medal of Honor. He began campaigning for it immediately after the engagement at Kettle Hill, sending a barrage of letters and appeals to everyone in Washington he thought might help. Quote, I do wish you would get that Medal of Honor from me. I think I earned it, he wrote to Lodge. I don't ask this as a favor. I ask it as a right, unquote. Generals scoffed at Roosevelt's presumption. He was a volunteer officer whose military career barely spanned a summer and who had seen just 2.5 days of combat, 2 half days of combat. Nonetheless, he relentlessly pressed his case. He was singularly unsuccessful until, 84 years after his death, President Bill Clinton, citing his, quote, extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, unquote, awarded him the Medal of Honor posthumously. The American campaign in Cuba was not much of a war, just a few weeks of scattered engagements between mismatched armies and navies. There was little true heroism. Deaths from disease outnumbered combat deaths by 8 to 1. Isn't that important? Deaths by disease outnumbered combat deaths by 8 to 1. And then when you realize that, and then you think about, Samuel Gompers and the effort to cut that canal running into malaria. And then we have the entire explosion of medicine, and Rockefeller medicine takes off. Newspapers overflowed with delirious reports of battlefield victories. Patriotic pride gripped the national soul. Americans had their first taste of overseas conquest, and they loved it. Lodge decided to take advantage of the mood. On July 6th, he asked the Senate to approve the annexation of Hawaii. The House of Representatives had already approved the annexation. President McKinley favored it, and a vote in the Senate was all that stood between the United States and a colony more than 2,000 miles beyond California. Senator William V. Allen of Nebraska began the debate by calling this the greatest question that's ever been presented to the American people. He warned that taking Hawaii would be only, quote, the first act in the drama of colonization, and that as the drama unfolded, the United States would be tempted to seize every little dimple in either the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean that may force its head above the surface of the water. Another prairie populist, Richard Pettigrew of South Dakota, read from documents showing that the overthrow of Hawaii's monarchy 5 years earlier had been the work of white planters and their friends, supported by the United States, and that the natives strongly opposed it. Supporters of annexation took these assaults calmly because they were confident of victory. And again, isn't that the way things are now? We can complain about things, but then we get censored or somehow disqualified from the debate, and our voices aren't heard. And so they don't even care if I say this, if I say something. Well, the guy's only got a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand people watching him. It's insignificant. We're going to win this thing. That's the way they felt. So the Senate voted 42 in favor of annexation to 21 opposed, 26 abstaining. Moments later, the House passed the War Revenue Bill to which the annexation proposal was attached. Isn't that interesting? That, again, the going around the intended procedure of the Constitution, which should have had a treaty involved or could have had a treaty involved, but instead they make it into a rider on a different bill, on the War Revenue Bill. and thereby it comes in just like all of these, these 800-page bills that nobody reads nowadays. Well, that's the same thing. Hurrah for Hawaii, Roosevelt wrote to Lodge from his camp in Cuba when he heard the news. Then he added, "Did I tell you that I killed a Spaniard with my own hands when I led the storm of the first redoubt? Probably I did." Unquote. Americans who hated the idea of overseas expansion were aghast at the vote to annex Hawaii, but in one way it helped their incipient movement. It brought them another potent leader and spokesman, Grover Cleveland, who had served 8 years in the White House and finished his second term just 16 months before. As president, Cleveland had blocked the annexation of Hawaii and even tried to reinstate the deposed queen. On the day his successor signed the annexation resolution, he sent a disgusted letter to a friend that showed how far some Americans were from Roosevelt's, quote, hurrah for Hawaii triumphalism. "Hawaii is ours," Cleveland wrote, "as I look back on the first steps in this miserable business, and as I contemplate the means used to complete the outrage, I am ashamed of the whole affair. Our government was formed with the express purpose of creating in a new world a new nation," Cleveland said in one speech, "the foundation of which should be man's self-government, whose safety and prosperity should be secured in its absolute freedom from old world complications and in its renunciation of all schemes of foreign conquest." Unquote. Yeah, there's something to remember Grover Cleveland for. Hearst ridiculed Cleveland's anti-imperialism. He directed one of his cartoonists to draw an image of an expiring Cleveland trying to unsuccessfully rise from his deathbed. If Mr. Cleveland were alive, it would be in order to ask him how it happens that our government has taken root in the vast domain over which it serves a free, happy, and prosperous people. Hmm. Cleveland's outspoken statements gave anti-imperialists new reason for hope. For 3 months, their message had been drowned out by public cheering for triumph at Manila Bay, battlefield victories in Cuba, and the annexation of Hawaii. Now they were attracting first rank leaders. The Cuban War ended quickly. On July 16th, commanders on both sides agreed to terms of capitulation. Their accord was special in one way. Spain surrendered not to Cuban rebels, but to the United States. Well, there you go. Is that not what happens when you trust, you know, the elites? Say, well, we'll take care of you. We know more than you do. We are able to make judgments about whether or not other people are capable of self-government. And when we see that they're not, then we trick them. We trick them into thinking we're going to support their revolution, and then we take over. And isn't that the story? What's going on now in the world is another example of the same elite takeover of the power, of the honor, of the public trust, full faith and credit, the sacrifices of our ancestors, the sacrifices of our people today. Isn't that what's at stake? And if we look back to where we went wrong in 1898 and re-examine people like Grover Cleveland, Carl Schurz, others who opposed the change of our country from a republic to an empire, then we can find our way back. And I hope we do. Thanks for being with me this morning. And I'll turn it back over to Neighborhood News Studio, where where the rest of the day has been scheduled, and I'm sure that George Webb will be up next. So stick around, Neighborhood News Studio. for the rest of their programming today. Tonight, please come back to McDuff Lives 3, where I'll have another exciting interview with the great Garland Nixon. So join us tonight, McDuff Lives 3, 8 p.m. And thanks very much to everybody at Neighborhood News Studio. I really appreciate our association. Take care, everyone.